The night Farrah Jones carried a bowl of watered broth to the old stone well for the 9th time, the moon hung thin and pale over the eastern towers, and she did not know that the creature waiting behind the ivy wall was older than the crown itself. She did not know that above her head, 12 alpha princesses were being dressed in silk stitched with real starlight thread. She did not know that King Gilbert Parsons had returned from the northern border only 3 days ago, his war council still arguing over which princess would secure the strongest alliance. She did not know that a prophecy older than the palace foundations was about to open its eyes. What she knew was smaller than all of that. The wolf under the broken archway was still breathing. The gash along its shoulder had finally stopped bleeding through the cloth she'd wrapped it in. And the broth in her hands was still warm. That was the whole size of her world that night. A bowl. A bandage. A creature that had not died, because she refused to let it. If a voice could have looked down on her kneeling there in the dark, it might have said this instead: the night Farrah Jones fed a dying wolf for the 9th time, she was already being chosen. And by morning, an entire kingdom would learn that kindness keeps a longer memory than blood ever does. She knelt beside the wall with her knees pressed into cold gravel. Frost hadn't come yet, but the air already carried that thin, biting edge that crawled through the sleeve of her patched gray dress. She'd torn that sleeve 8 nights ago to bind the wolf's wound, and she never asked the seamstress for a new one, because asking meant being noticed, and being noticed, in her experience, meant being hurt. So she moved through the palace grounds with one arm always a little cold, and nobody looked twice, because nobody had truly looked at Farrah Jones in 5 years. 5 years ago, the sweating sickness came through the lower village like a wildfire through dry wheat. The healers fled. The nobles barred their gates. And an 18-year-old kitchen girl with no titles and no family left standing walked into the sick houses when everyone else walked out. She held dying hands. She boiled water until her own fingers blistered. She buried more of her neighbors than she could count, and when the sickness finally burned itself out, the kingdom thanked its healers, thanked its guards, thanked its king, and never learned her name. She didn't mind, or told herself she didn't. Being forgotten was safer than being seen. Being seen was how Cale had found her, 2 years back, in the lesser chapel, in a borrowed white dress that wasn't even her size, and told his family. Plainly, without a flicker of shame, that the goddess must have made a mistake pairing him with an Omega kitchen maid, and that he refused the bond in front of everyone who had come to watch. She had stood there and let the whole village see her rejected like a returned parcel. So Farrah stopped being seen on purpose after that. And the wolf under the archway was the first thing in 2 years that had looked at her like she mattered. Chapter 1, The Forgotten Maid. The wolf's eyes opened when the broth steam reached its nose. Not the golden eyes of an ordinary beast. These were pale blue, like ice held up to a candle, and when they found her face, something in them steadied. The way a frightened animal settles once it recognizes the hand that has fed it 8 nights running. Easy, Farrah whispered, tipping the bowl toward its jaw. It's only me. The wolf drank slowly. Its fur, when the moonlight caught it right, seemed to carry a faint shimmer underneath the silver, like frost lit from within. She'd told herself it was moonlight playing tricks. She told herself a lot of things to keep from wondering too hard about a wolf that never growled at her, never snapped, and somehow always seemed to know the exact hour she would come. They're choosing a Luna tomorrow, she said, because talking to the wolf was easier than talking to no one. 12 princesses. My friend Lily says the whole Eastern Hall smells like rose oil already. She smoothed a hand along its uninjured shoulder. I won't be there, of course. Maid scrubbed the floor after, not before. The wolf huffed, a sound almost like a laugh, and pressed its great head briefly against her palm before she rose to leave. She didn't know, walking back through the servants' gate, that Lily was already awake and waiting for her by the kitchen door, arms crossed, curls escaping her cap. You smell like broth and secrets, Lily said. I smell like dish water, Farrah said. Same thing, with you. Lily fell into step beside her, lowering her voice as they passed the guard post. Everyone upstairs is losing their minds. 12 princesses, and half of them hate each other already. Princess Amy's the only one who's been decent to the staff. The rest act like we're furniture that talks. And the king? Handsome, exhausted, says maybe 6 words a day. Lily grinned. Captain Nicholas says he'd rather be back at the border than sit through one more ball. Farrah almost smiled. Almost. She had learned, 5 years ago, that smiling too openly invited questions, and questions always circled back to why a girl who once ran the sick houses alone now scrubbed floors and spoke to no one. So she kept her voice light instead. Let's hope the wolf legend doesn't disappoint them tomorrow. The celestial wolf. Lily's eyes went round with the particular thrill of palace gossip. They say it hasn't shown itself in 1,000 years. They say the first king bound its loyalty with a blood oath, and it only reappears when the bloodline needs guiding. Chancellor Stribling's been fussing over the ceremony for a month like his life depends on it going perfectly. Maybe it does, Farrah murmured, and didn't know how true that sentence was. She didn't tell Lily about the wolf in the garden. She had learned that secrets, unlike friendships, could not be taken from her. And some nights, the only thing she owned outright in the entire kingdom was the hours she spent behind the ivy wall with a creature who asked nothing of her except that she keep coming back. Chapter 2, The Day of Choosing. The Great Hall had never held so much gold at once. Banners bearing the wolf crest hung between marble pillars, candlelight pooling gold across floors polished so bright the princess's reflection seemed to curtsy along with them. 12 alpha princesses stood in a slow crescent before the dais, each gown a small fortune, each posture rehearsed since childhood for exactly this moment. King Gilbert Parsons sat the throne like a man carrying armor even without it. 35 years old, black hair falling loose to his shoulders, ice-blue eyes that had watched too many border skirmishes to soften easily. His cloak, deep midnight blue and stitched with the same celestial symbols as the banners, pooled around the throne's base. Beside him, Chancellor Stribling stood with his hands folded into his sleeves, silver-haired, gray-eyed, a smile arranged carefully on his face like a man who had rehearsed sincerity until it looked natural. "Your Majesty," Stribling said, voice pitched to carry, "the ancient rite begins. The celestial wolf, guardian of the bloodline since the first crown, will walk among your candidates and choose the one whose spirit aligns with the throne's fate." Gilbert said nothing. He had agreed to this ceremony because his council insisted the people needed the old prophecy honored, not because he believed a wolf that hadn't been seen in a millennium would obligingly appear on command. He expected an actor in a costume, or nothing at all. Then the great doors at the far end of the hall groaned open on their own, and every candle in the room dimmed at once, as though the air itself had inhaled. The celestial wolf entered. It was not the size of any living wolf. Its shoulders alone stood taller than a grown man's waist, and its fur held that same faint inner shimmer Farrah had noticed in the dark, except here, under full candlelight, the shimmer became unmistakable. Threads of pale blue light moved beneath its coat like veins of a slow river, and where its paws touched the marble, faint silver runes bloomed and faded with each step. Its eyes were the color of ice held to flame. Every princess froze. A few of the younger nobles gasped audibly. Gilbert rose halfway from his throne without meaning to. The wolf walked the crescent of princesses slowly, deliberately, its massive head lowering to each one in turn as if reading something no human eye could see. And at each princess, after a heartbeat too long to be comfortable, it turned away. The first refusal drew nervous laughter. The third drew whispers. By the seventh, the room had gone utterly silent, 12 carefully composed faces cracking one by one into confusion and something close to fear. At the 12th, Princess Amy, blonde hair braided with gold thread, the only one of the 12 who did not flinch when the wolf's eyes met hers, it paused the longest. Amy lifted her chin, steady, waiting. The wolf huffed softly, almost gently, and turned away from her too, though something in the motion looked less like rejection and more like apology. "It has rejected them all," Stribling said, and for the first time his rehearsed calm slipped, just slightly, at the edges. That has never happened. The right has never." The celestial wolf turned from the dais entirely and began walking toward the side doors, toward the servants' corridor, where a line of staff stood pressed against the wall to stay out of sight of the ceremony. Where Farrah Jones stood at the very end of that line, a folded stack of linens in her arms, trying to make herself as small and forgettable as she'd trained herself to be for 5 years. Chapter 3, The Impossible Bow. The wolf's paws struck the marble in long, unhurried strides, and every noble in the hall turned to watch where it was going, because it was clearly going somewhere, and that somewhere was not the throne. Farrah felt it before she understood it, the air changing, growing warm and electric, the way it had every night behind the ivy wall. Her arms went rigid around the linens. She told herself it wasn't possible. She told herself the wolf in her garden and the legend in this hall could not be the same creature, because if they were, then every quiet hour she'd spent whispering to it in secret had actually been. The wolf stopped in front of her. Up close, in full light, she could see the faint scar along its shoulder where she'd bound the wound 8 nights running, now nearly healed, the fur growing back silver white over old torn skin. The hall held its breath. Then the celestial wolf lowered its massive head and bowed before her, the way no legend had ever bowed before an Omega Maid in 1,000 years, the way nothing in this kingdom's history had prepared any single person in that room to witness. The linen slipped from Farrah's arms and hit the marble floor. For one full breath, nobody moved. Then the hall erupted. Princesses gasping, nobles surging forward against the guards' outstretched arms, Stribling's composed mask cracking fully into something sharper and more alarm than shock. Gilbert had come down from the dais without realizing he'd left it, his boots striking the marble in quick, uneven steps, ice-blue eyes fixed not on the wolf but on the maid it had chosen. "Rise," Farrah whispered, so quietly only the wolf could have heard her, her voice shaking. "Please. You're going to get me killed." The wolf lifted its head, met her eyes, and, impossibly, unmistakably, it looked amused. Then it turned, faced the stunned court, and let out a sound that was not quite a howl and not quite a word, a sound that rattled the stained glass in the high windows and sent every candle flame leaping tall at once. When the sound faded, the ancient runes carved into the base of the dais, runes nobody in the room had ever seen glow before, began to pulse faintly with the same pale blue light woven through the wolf's coat. "The prophecy," Stribling said, and this time his voice cracked entirely. "It's, the bloodline seal is answering her." Gilbert stopped an arm's length from Farrah, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, close enough that she could see he was breathing like a man who'd run a long way in a very short time. Up close he was less like the distant king of palace gossip and more like an ordinary man staring at something he couldn't explain. "What is your name?" he asked, and his voice, low and rough, carried through a hall gone completely silent. "Farrah, your majesty." "Farrah Jones." She dropped into the deepest curtsy her shaking knees could manage, eyes on the floor, because looking a king in the eye was one more way to be noticed, and being noticed had never once gone well for her. "I clean the East Wing. I don't know why it did that. I'm nobody." "You are not nobody," Gilbert said, and something in his tone made even Stribling go quiet. "Not to that wolf. And apparently, not to this kingdom's oldest prophecy." Chapter 4, The Maid the King Cannot Forget. By the following evening, half the palace had an opinion about Farrah Jones, and none of them had asked her for hers. She'd been moved from the servants' quarters into a modest guest chamber in the East Tower, a room with real glass in the windows and a bed she was almost afraid to sit on. Lily had smuggled herself in twice already, first to shriek with excitement, second to bring bread because Farrah had forgotten to eat. "You're the talk of the whole kingdom," Lily said, perched on the window seat, swinging her feet. Nobles are saying the wolf senses royal blood hidden in commoners. Others say it's cursed you. Worsley in the stables says it's a sign the crown's about to fall. Everyone's got a theory and none of them have met you. I'd like to go back to nobody having a theory about me at all, Farrah admitted. A knock interrupted before Lily could answer. When Farrah opened the door, King Gilbert stood in the hallway alone, without guards, without Stribling trailing at his elbow, his cloak gone, just a simple dark tunic that made him look less like a throne and more like a tired man who hadn't slept. Lily made herself scarce with a speed that would have impressed a palace spy. "I've read the reports from 5 years ago," Gilbert said without preamble, stepping into the room only after Farrah gestured him in, standing carefully near the door as though he understood how thin the line was between kindness and intrusion. "The sweating sickness. The sick houses in the lower village." Farrah's stomach tightened. "That was a long time ago. You stayed when the healers left. Someone had to. You buried 31 people with your own hands, according to the parish record, and the crown never once sent so much as a letter of thanks." His jaw tightened. "That is a failure of mine, even if I wasn't yet king when it happened. I intend to correct it. I didn't do it for thanks." Her voice came out sharper than she meant it to, 5 years of swallowed grief rising faster than she could stop it. "I did it because the alternative was watching people die alone in the dark, and I couldn't live with that. I don't need a king's apology for something I chose." Something shifted in Gilbert's expression, not offense, but a kind of recognition, as though he'd expected flattery and gotten honesty instead, and found he preferred it. "No," he agreed quietly. "But you'll have it anyway. Some debts get paid whether or not the person is asking to be repaid." They stood in a silence that wasn't quite uncomfortable. Outside the window, the last of the evening light turned the palace gardens gold, and somewhere beyond the ivy wall, Farrah knew, a wolf that was apparently far more than a wolf was probably watching the same sunset. "Why did it choose you?" Gilbert asked finally. The truth, not the curtsy answer. "I've been feeding it," she admitted. "In the garden. For 9 nights. It was hurt, and no one else could see it, and I couldn't just..." She stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish. "I couldn't leave it to die alone either. I suppose I have a habit of that." Gilbert studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its careful royal distance entirely. "That habit," he said, "may be the most important thing that has happened to this kingdom in 1,000 years. He didn't leave right away. He lingered by the window instead, looking out at the darkening gardens as though he wasn't quite ready to hand the evening back to duty, and Farrah found herself studying him the way she used to study the wolf in the dark, carefully, half in disbelief that something so large and so guarded could stand this close without demanding anything from her. "You keep looking at me like you expect me to vanish," Gilbert said without turning. "I expect most good things to be temporary," she admitted, before she could stop herself. "It's easier that way. Less to lose when they leave." He turned then, and the look on his face wasn't pity, which she'd braced for, but something steadier. "Then let me be the exception," he said. "I don't intend on being temporary, Farrah Jones." She didn't have an answer for that. She'd spent 5 years building walls thin enough to survive behind and thick enough to keep everyone out, and this man had walked past every one of them in under a week without seeming to notice they were there at all. "Get some rest," he said finally, softer. "Tomorrow the whole court will have questions. Tonight, you don't owe anyone any answers." He paused at the door. "Except me, eventually. But I can wait for that too." When the door closed behind him, Farrah sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed for a long time, one hand pressed to her chest, trying to name the feeling sitting there. It took her a while to recognize it, because it had been so long since she'd felt it toward anyone. Hope, unguarded and a little frightening, the way it always was when it hadn't been earned back slowly enough to trust. Chapter 5, Secrets Beneath the Palace. While the court buzzed over Farrah's sudden and inexplicable rise, Captain Nicholas was 3 floors below ground, holding a lantern to a wall that shouldn't have existed. He'd gone looking for a missing inventory of celestial relics, old ceremonial items tied to the bloodline rite, the kind of thing nobody checked twice a decade. And instead found a passage behind a false shelf in the lower archive, its stones worn smooth by far more foot traffic than any sealed vault should have. "Lily," he said, when the young maid nearly walked into him at the bottom of the stairs, having followed his lantern light out of pure curiosity, "you should not be down here." "Neither should this tunnel," Lily shot back, peering past him. "Where does it go?" "That," Nicholas said grimly, "is exactly what worries me." They followed it together, against his better judgment, and entirely because Lily refused to be left behind and he'd rather keep an eye on her than let her wander alone, until the passage opened into a small chamber lined with empty velvet-lined cases. Cases clearly built to hold relics. Cases that were, every one of them, empty. The reliquary inventory said everything was accounted for, Nicholas muttered. "Signed off a month ago. By Chancellor Stribling himself." "Maybe he moved them somewhere safer," Lily offered, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it either. Nicholas crouched by the nearest case and found, tucked into its lining, a torn scrap of parchment with a foreign seal pressed into the wax, a seal belonging to a border kingdom the crown had been quietly negotiating with for the better part of a year. "Or," he said slowly, "he sold them." They emerged from the tunnel an hour later with more questions than answers, and Nicholas made Lily swear, 3 separate times, not to breathe a word of it to anyone until he'd verified what they'd found. Lily agreed, mostly, and immediately began composing in her head exactly how she'd tell Farrah anyway, because some secrets were too heavy to carry alone, and Farrah, impossibly, suddenly, was no longer nobody, which meant she was no longer someone Lily could protect simply by staying quiet. Interlude: the princess who did not become an enemy. Farrah expected resentment from Princess Amy, and braced for it the way she braced for most things, quietly, without complaint, already rehearsing how she'd survive it. Instead, 3 days after the ceremony, Amy appeared at her door with a bolt of pale blue fabric under one arm and no guards trailing behind her. "I imagine you think I hate you," Amy said, letting herself in with the easy confidence of someone who had never once needed permission to enter a room. "The thought had occurred to me," Farrah admitted. "I spent 19 years being raised for exactly one purpose, and a wolf decided in about 4 seconds that purpose belonged to someone else." Amy set the fabric down and studied Farrah with open, curious eyes, no malice in them at all. "I could hate you for that. It would be easier, honestly. But I watched you catch that wolf's attention days before it ever glowed in front of the whole court, and I don't hate people for being chosen for the right reasons. I only hate losing for reasons that make no sense. This one makes sense. You're taking this remarkably well." "I'm furious," Amy said cheerfully, "in the way you're furious about weather. It happened, it wasn't personal, and standing in the rain complaining about it never once made me dry." She held the fabric up against Farrah's shoulder, assessing the color with a critical eye. "Besides, I'd rather be your friend in a palace than your rival in one. Rivals get poisoned in stories like this. Friends get invited to the good dinners." Despite herself, Farrah laughed, a real one, short and surprised, the first in longer than she could easily count. "You're very strange for a princess. You're very stubborn for a maid the kingdom is about to crown," Amy said. "I think we'll manage." It was, Farrah would think later, the beginning of the first friendship she had allowed herself since the sickness took most of the people she used to trust. Amy did not ask her to be anything other than what she already was, and that, more than any gown or ceremony, was the gift Farrah hadn't known she was still capable of receiving. Chapter 6: The Forgotten Heroine. The following week, King Gilbert did something no ruler in the kingdom's memory had done. He held a public ceremony not for a victory or a wedding, but for a debt. He stood before the assembled court, Farrah beside him in a simple dress of pale blue that Princess Amy, of all people, had insisted on gifting her, and told the story of the sweating sickness plainly, without embellishment, because the truth needed none. 5 years ago, this kingdom was saved by a girl none of you thought worth remembering, Gilbert said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. She held the hands of the dying when the rest of us were too afraid to. She asked for nothing in return, and she received nothing, until a creature older than this throne walked past 12 princesses to remind us what we had forgotten to see. Princess Amy, standing near the front, was the first to bow her head in respect. One by one, the court followed, nobles who had mocked Farrah's patched sleeves a week earlier, servants who had never learned her name, all lowering their eyes in the kind of silence that meant something entirely different from the silence of 5 years ago. Farrah stood very still through it, unused to being looked at with anything other than pity or disdain, and found herself, for the first time in years, unable to find a single word to say. Gilbert glanced sideways at her, and something in his expression, steady, warm, entirely unguarded, told her she didn't need to. Afterward, in the quiet of the palace gardens, with the celestial wolf curled contentedly near the ivy wall like an enormous, luminous hound, Gilbert found her again. "You didn't smile in there," he said. "Even when the whole court bowed." "I didn't know how to," she admitted. "I spent 5 years being invisible on purpose. It's strange, being seen. I don't entirely trust it yet." "Then I'll be patient," Gilbert said simply, "until you do." The wolf, watching them both with its ice-blue eyes, made a low, satisfied sound in its chest, as though it had been waiting a very long time for exactly this conversation to happen, and was glad, finally, to have lived to see it. Interlude, What the Garden Knows. 3 nights before the Luna announcement, Gilbert found Farrah exactly where he expected to, beneath the ivy wall, the celestial wolf curled beside her like an enormous, glowing hearth fire, her fingers absently combing through fur that shimmered faintly under the moon. "You still come out here every night," he said, settling onto the stone bench across from her without being invited, which she'd learned by now was simply how he moved through the world. Steady, certain, never demanding room but never quite waiting for permission either. "Old habits," she said. "Even now that he doesn't need feeding anymore." "Does he have a name?" Gilbert asked. "Beyond Celestial Wolf." "That feels like a title, not a name." Farrah considered this, surprised she'd never thought to ask. The wolf lifted its head at the question, ice-blue eyes glinting with something like amusement, and huffed a low sound that felt, somehow, like an answer offered privately, meant for her alone to understand. "He says I already gave him one," she said slowly, testing the strangeness of the thought even as she said it aloud. "The first night. I called him Frost, because of the way his fur caught the light. I didn't think he was listening closely enough to remember it. A guardian who answers to a name a kitchen maid gave him in secret," Gilbert said, something warm breaking through his usual composure. "I think that suits this kingdom's new direction rather well." They sat together in comfortable quiet after that, the kind that didn't need filling, Frost's steady breathing the only sound beside the distant murmur of palace life continuing on without them. Farrah found, somewhere in that silence, that she no longer flinched at being looked at the way Gilbert looked at her, openly, without calculation, as though she were simply the most interesting person he'd found in a kingdom full of them. "I used to think being unseen was safer," she admitted quietly. "Nobody can take something from you they don't know you have. And now? Now I think I spent 5 years protecting myself from a kind of hurt that never showed up." She glanced sideways at him. "You make it very hard to stay guarded, Your Majesty." "Good," Gilbert said simply, and when he reached over and laced his fingers through hers, she let him, and did not once think about letting go. If this story has already pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss where it ends, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I would love to say hello and find out how far our story has traveled tonight. Chapter 7, Betrayal in the Royal Court. Chancellor Stribling had spent 30 years learning how to smile at people while planning their downfall, and Farrah Jones, Luna chosen, wolf blessed, suddenly beloved by a court that used to overlook her entirely, had become a problem too large to smile away. He met his contact in the same lower archive chamber Nicholas had found, unaware the captain had already tightened watch on every entrance to it. The relics were meant to fund an army, Stribling hissed to the cloaked messenger across from him. Not a coronation gift for some kitchen maid the wolf took a fancy to. If she's crowned Luna, every alliance I've spent a decade building collapses. The border kingdoms won't trust a throne that lets guardianship be decided by sentiment instead of bloodline. Then remove her, the messenger said simply. Removing her isn't enough while that creature guards her. It has to be the wolf first. Stribling's gray eyes hardened. There are old bindings. Celestial cages built for exactly this purpose, back when the first king feared his own guardian's judgment. I know where the last one is buried. Unseen in the shadows past the tunnel's bend, Worsley, palace steward, sandy-haired, weathered, a man who had quietly looked the other way on Stribling's smaller corruptions for years because his own family's debts depended on the chancellor's goodwill. Heard every word, and felt something in his chest that had been asleep a long time finally wake up. He had been paid to be blind. He had not been paid to watch a plot to murder a girl the entire kingdom had only just learned to see. That night, Worsley found Nicholas in the guard barracks and told him everything, hands shaking, voice low. I should have come to you sooner, he admitted. I was afraid. I'm still afraid. But I'd rather be afraid and honest than safe and guilty. Nicholas gripped his shoulder once, firmly. Then let's make sure that fear was worth something. Chapter 8, The Kingdom's Darkest Night. The coup came on the night of the formal Luna announcement, timed precisely for the hour the court would be gathered, gates open, guards stretched thin across ceremony rather than defense. Stribling's hired swords moved through the lower gates disguised as ceremonial escorts, and by the time the alarm bells rang, they had already breached the inner courtyard. Steel rang against steel across the palace grounds. Nicholas led the royal guard into the courtyard with Worsley's warning giving them the narrow edge of preparation that meant the difference between ambush and battle. Gilbert fought at the front line of his own defense, ice-blue eyes blazing, cutting through the confusion with the same discipline that had kept him alive 5 years at the northern border. Torches spilled across the courtyard stones, and the shouts of guards mixed with the ring of steel and the panicked scatter of nobles who had come dressed for a coronation and found themselves caught in the middle of a war they didn't understand. Sean, the young messenger, had been halfway to the stables when the first blade was drawn, and instead of running for safety, he swung himself onto the nearest horse and rode hard for the border garrison, Nicholas's sealed evidence against Stribling tucked inside his coat, because a coup this large needed more than palace guards to answer it. And someone needed to make certain the border kingdoms heard the truth before Stribling's allies could twist it into something else. He rode through the night without stopping, and arrived at the garrison gates with his horse lathered and his voice hoarse, but the message delivered all the same. Back in the courtyard, Worsley fought beside men half his age with a kitchen cleaver he'd grabbed on instinct, driven by a guilt he intended to spend the rest of his life making up for. But the true target of the night revealed itself only when a company of Stribling's men broke away toward the palace gardens, toward the ivy wall, toward the one guardian whose presence made every other part of the plot impossible to finish. They carried the celestial cage between them, an ancient lattice of iron and bound light, humming with a frequency that made the celestial wolf's steps falter the moment it came within range. The wolf fought, but the cage was built by ancestors who had once feared their own guardian's judgment, and it closed around the great creature with a sound like a struck bell, draining the pale blue light from its fur until it dimmed to something closer to ordinary silver, weakened, trapped, its strength bleeding away with every passing minute. Farrah reached the garden just as the cage sealed shut, Lily half a step behind her, both of them having slipped away from the ceremony the moment the alarm bells rang. No, Farrah breathed, dropping to her knees beside the cage, pressing her palms against the humming lattice despite the pain that shot up her arms at the contact. No, no, let it go, please. The wolf's eyes found hers, pale blue dimming toward gray, and in them she saw not fear for itself, but fear for her, for what would happen the moment its strength ran out entirely and the ancient seal it had woken went dark along with it. "Stay with me," Farrah begged, her voice cracking on the words, her hands still pressed flat against the humming lattice despite the pain climbing up both arms. "You didn't get to choose me just to leave. That isn't how this works. That isn't how any of this is allowed to work." Lily knelt beside her, tearing a strip from her own apron with shaking hands, trying uselessly to wrap it around Farrah's burned palms, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her freckled cheeks. "Don't you dare do something reckless," she warned, though her voice had none of its usual brightness left in it. "I didn't survive sneaking down that tunnel with Nicholas just to watch you do something reckless." Farrah didn't answer. She was already searching the base of the cage with both hands, fingers trembling over cold iron, looking for anything the ancient binders might have missed. Chapter 9, The Celestial Prophecy. Gilbert found them like that, Farrah kneeling at the cage, hands bleeding faintly where the celestial iron had burned her skin, Nicholas and the guard finally driving Stribling's remaining forces back through the outer gate behind him, the Chancellor himself cornered near the garden wall with nowhere left to run. "End this," Stribling said, though his voice had lost every ounce of its old composure, "and the throne survives. Let the wolf fade, and the alliances I built hold. One creature, one maid, against an entire kingdom's stability. It was never a difficult choice." "It was never your choice to make," Gilbert said, his sword leveled at the man who had served his family for 30 years and spent every one of them quietly rotting the foundation beneath it. "You have no idea what it costs to hold a kingdom together," Stribling spat, backing toward the garden wall, his composed mask finally gone entirely, replaced by something raw and cornered. "I built alliances while you were still learning to hold a sword. I kept the treasury solvent while your father spent it on wars he couldn't win. And you would burn all of it down for a maid who scrubs floors." "I would burn nothing down for her," Gilbert said, quiet and certain. "But I would burn every alliance you built on stolen relics and broken oaths, because a kingdom held together by theft was never actually standing to begin with. You didn't keep this crown solvent, Stribling. You kept it convenient. Those aren't the same thing, and I think you've always known it." Stribling had no answer for that. He looked, for the first time since Farrah had met him, entirely and unmistakably small. Farrah wasn't listening to either of them. She had found, at the base of the cage, a single unlocked seam, old iron, weakened by 1,000 years of disuse, needing only something the original binders had never accounted for, someone willing to give rather than take. "I know what you are now," she whispered to the wolf, voice shaking, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. "I don't need the prophecy to tell me. I just need you to stay." She pressed her bleeding palms flat against the seam and gave the cage the only thing she had ever had in abundance and never once considered valuable, her own life force, offered freely, the same way she'd once offered 31 dying strangers her hands and her nights and her fear, because some part of her had always believed other people's survival mattered more than her own. The cage began to crack. But the celestial wolf, gathering the last of its dimming strength, did something the ancient prophecy had never predicted and no binder had ever accounted for. Instead of accepting the sacrifice pouring into the seam, it pushed back against it, refusing the exchange, forcing its own restored strength outward through the breaking iron instead of drawing hers away. Light exploded across the garden. Not the cold blue of the cage, but a deep, warm gold that swept through every noble and guard still gathered at the garden's edge, through Gilbert, through Stribling frozen mid-step, through the whole watching court that had followed the fighting out from the great hall. When it faded, the cage lay in broken pieces on the grass, and the celestial wolf stood whole and radiant above Farrah, its voice, for the first time in the kingdom's written history, forming words instead of sound. "She was never chosen because she saved me," the wolf said, and its voice rolled through the garden like distant thunder softened by rain. "She was chosen because for 5 years, her compassion has quietly kept the bloodline seal alive when every noble who should have honored it forgot it existed. The prophecy was never about strength. It was never about crowns. It chooses the kindest heart in the kingdom, generation after generation, because a throne without mercy is only a very expensive chair. The court, kneeling now in the grass, in their ceremony silks, understood at last exactly what, and who, had been protecting them without recognition for 5 long years. Stribling was taken by the guard without another word from him, his schemes laid as bare as the empty velvet cases 3 floors below. Chapter 10, The Queen Chosen by Mercy. The coronation, when it finally came, was smaller than anyone expected and warmer than anyone remembered a royal ceremony being. Farrah stood before the same great hall where 12 princesses had once been rejected in front of her, wearing a gown of pale gold rather than borrowed white, and this time, when a man took her hand in front of the whole kingdom, it was not to refuse her. Gilbert placed the crown himself, his hands steady despite what she could see, in his eyes, was an entirely different kind of nervousness than any battlefield had ever given him. Farrah Jones, he said, loud enough for the whole hall, gentle enough that it felt like it belonged only to her, chosen not by blood, not by birth, but by every quiet kindness this kingdom nearly failed to notice. I could not ask for a better Luna, or a better partner, for whatever comes next. Princess Amy, seated in the front row beside her own new betrothed, a match made not through the old rite but through an alliance she'd chosen herself, with Farrah and Gilbert's blessing, wiped her eyes without any shame at all and mouthed a silent, sincere finally across the hall. Lily stood near the back with Nicholas and Worsley, all 3 of them grinning like people who had, in their own ways, helped carry the truth far enough that it could finally stand on its own. Sean, the young royal messenger who'd ridden 2 days straight to deliver Nicholas's evidence to the border council before Stribling's allies could scatter, leaned against a pillar looking thoroughly pleased with himself and thoroughly ready for the next adventure the kingdom might throw at him. Outside, in the gardens where it had all begun, Frost lay stretched beneath the same ivy wall, fur glowing soft and steady in the afternoon sun, watching the celebration drift out through the open doors with the patient, satisfied look of a guardian who had finally, after 1,000 years, found exactly what it had been waiting for. Chancellor Stribling stood trial before the full court within the month, the empty velvet cases and the foreign seal Nicholas had found serving as evidence no clever tongue could talk its way around. He was stripped of his title and his lands, exiled beyond the border he had so carelessly sold pieces of the kingdom to, and Gilbert appointed a new council seat to Nicholas, whose loyalty had never once wavered, and a quieter, smaller honor to Worsley, who asked for nothing beyond the chance to keep serving a palace he'd finally stopped being ashamed of. Lily, of all people, became the new head of the Eastern staff within the year, a promotion she accepted with the same bright, unstoppable enthusiasm she brought to everything, and the first thing she did with her new authority was make certain no maid in that wing ever again went unnoticed the way Farrah once had. Sean returned from the border garrison a minor hero in his own right, and made a habit of visiting the palace kitchens often enough that even Lily, sharp-tongued as she was, eventually stopped pretending she minded. Princess Amy found her own happiness within the year as well, in an alliance built on genuine affection rather than old obligation, and remained close enough to the crown that she and Farrah shared tea most weeks, trading stories and complaints about court life like the old friends they had somehow, unexpectedly, become. Years later, when Farrah told the story to her own children, a boy with his father's steady eyes and a girl with her mother's quiet, unshakable kindness, she never once made herself the hero of it. The wolf didn't choose me because I was special, she would tell them, sitting beneath that same ivy wall while the great silver guardian dozed nearby, older now than any of them but no less luminous. It chose me because I chose, over and over, on nights nobody was watching, to be kind anyway. That's all it ever takes. That's all it ever took. Before we close this story out, if kindness quietly winning against every kind of cruelty is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe now so you're here for the next one, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one, and I'd love to say hello. What this story leaves behind. Every legend worth telling twice leaves something behind besides the ending. Here is what tonight's story quietly asks us to carry forward. Kindness is never wasted, even when no one is watching. Farrah's greatest strength was never a title or a bloodline. It was the simple, repeated choice to show up for someone else's pain when there was nothing in it for her. Being overlooked is not the same as being worthless. The kingdom's failure to see Farrah for 5 years never once changed what she was actually worth. Recognition catches up eventually, but her value never depended on it arriving. Real strength often looks quiet. Gilbert's kingdom had generals, armies, and ancient guardians, yet the person who held it all together was a maid with a bandage and a bowl of broth. Strength and gentleness were never opposites in this story, they were the same thing, worn differently. Corruption grows fastest in rooms nobody questions. Stribling's betrayal thrived for years precisely because no one thought to look behind the polished manners. Worsley's courage, coming forward late, but coming forward, reminds us that it is never too late to choose honesty over comfort. Love that is worth having never asks you to shrink. Gilbert never asked Farrah to become someone else to be worthy of him. He simply learned to see who she already was, and built his trust around that truth instead of around a crown. Thank you for staying until the very last word tonight. Stories like this one exist because people like you keep watching them all the way through. So subscribe if you haven't yet, share it with someone who needs reminding that mercy still wins, and I'll see you in the next one.